Okay, thank you for joining us. Hello. If you walk into any museum or contemporary art gallery today, you will not be surprised in the least to see large black and white or color photographs on view. In fact, in this post-medium age, photographs are more than likely to be sharing the exhibition space with paintings, works on paper, sculptures, video works, or installations. But it wasn't always that way. And to chart just that evolution, we have the pleasure of welcoming Andy Grundberg and Blake Gopnik for a conversation about Grundberg's new book, How Photography Became Contemporary Art, from Yale University Press. Andy Grundberg was the New York Times photography critic from 1981 to 1991, and an editor at Modern Photography prior to that. He's a writer and curator and was until recently professor and dean of the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design at George Washington University. His books include Crisis of the Real, which is a collection of 50 of his essays and reviews in the New York Times and other publications, which came out in 1999 and was reissued a few years ago from Aperture, as well as books on the photographer Alexei Brodovich and the twins and collaborators Mike and Doug Starn. Blake Gopnik is an arts writer who was the Washington Post's chief art critic from 2000 to 2010 and art critic for Newsweek and the Daily Beast until recently. He was trained, interestingly, in commercial photography and medieval Latin, a heady mix to be sure, and as we all know, a direct gateway to contemporary art. In his case, via an art history doctorate from Oxford University. He is the author of a biography of Andy Warhol that came out last year and has been called a fascinating major work that will spark endless debates. So thank you so much for both being here with us. How Photography Became Contemporary Art is a wonderful, enjoyable book. And as the title does not immediately reveal, it is very personal and even memoiristic, written as it is by someone who was an active participant in the New York art and photography world, just as it was morphing in the space of roughly 3 decades. Because of his professional career as a writer about photography, Grundberg was in a prime position to observe the shifting networks of artists, curators, critics, publishers, and dealers who worked with, alongside, and sometimes against one another. Without saying too much, I want to point out that the story begins in the mythical past, by which I mean 1962, with 3 coinciding events. One, Rauschenberg meeting Warhol and being inspired by the use of silk screening to work photographic images into paintings. 2, Ed Ruscha on the West Coast, photographing 26 gasoline stations in an entirely new, unaffected, understated, seemingly documentary, but really intriguing way. And 3, the nomination of John Sarkowski to lead MoMA's Department of Photography. And from there, it follows photography's steady infiltration of the contemporary art scene through the 70s and the 80s until 1991, which is the year Grundberg left the Times, and coincidentally also the year Sarkowski retired from MoMA. So by that point, there is a sense of an ending. Photography is truly part and parcel of the contemporary art world, but it is also tantalizingly just another beginning, that of the digital revolution. And 1990 is also the date of the first release of Adobe Photoshop. And since then, we have all become, to various extents, image sharers and image manipulators of an entirely new kind. So I'm sure this will be the focus of Andy's next book. But for now, let's discuss how photography became contemporary art. Over to you, Andy and Blake. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
Well, Andy, what a pleasure to be here with you. And Andy and I have known each other, it turns out, I just realized, for almost 20 years. I think we met almost 20 years ago in Washington. And in reading your book, I learned all sorts of things about you that I didn't already know. So that was a real treat. I'm also really pleased you obviously made the cover of this book just for me because it's got a bunch of Warhols on the cover. So that immediately attracted me to the book. But I thought I'd get you started as your interlocutor by asking a really difficult question that everyone is going to ask, namely, what is your book about? Can you give us a little précis? Because you know what? The book doesn't get released till next week. So I'm one of the few people who've actually had a chance to read the thing.
Well, good question, Blake. And thank you, Anthony, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining us for this hour. So as Anthony mentioned, the book is about a real paradigm shift in what contemporary art was. And photography is the medium that, to me, I argue in the book, is both the medium that propelled that paradigm shift, and also kind of the medium that became fascinating to artists, not only trained in photography, but artists of all stripes, as contemporary art left its former attraction to painting and sculpture. But at the same time, I didn't think I could write an art history without acknowledging the fact that I was in this milieu, experiencing this as it happened, which I think is what really made it so vivid. So part of the book introduces me as a person that's experiencing contemporary art, and I hope that readers today will have a sense of what it's like to encounter art at first glance that you may not fully comprehend, or that seems new and different and requires you to kind of comprehend over time what it is that artists are trying to do. So having said that, let me read a little section of the beginning of the book, which really sets the stage for how the book proceeds. As Anthony said, it starts with a chapter about 1962, but it's really focused on the 70s and the 80s, which were the decades that I lived in New York. So if I could read a little section. This is chapter 2, called Arrival. When I landed in Manhattan in the hot August of 1971, something remarkable was happening downtown. The transformation of a square-mile, nearly empty commercial neighborhood into a thriving center for contemporary art. I am, of course, speaking of Soho, the area south of Houston Street, roughly bounded by West Broadway on the west, Lafayette Street on the east, and Canal Street on the south. Although plenty of artists I knew lived on the downscale fringes of this territory, especially in what soon became known as Tribeca, the triangle below Canal. This transformation of a place that once had been a busy center for small manufacturing into a cultural mecca was a once-in-a-lifetime event for my generation, but also for New York City itself, since it has never been repeated. Visitors to today's Chelsea art neighborhood may want to dispute this claim, but they would miss what made Soho a real art neighborhood as opposed to a shopping center. For starters, the first people interested in Soho were not gallerists, but young artists who discovered that the open floors of the solidly constructed cast iron buildings that once held heavy equipment were ideal for their studios and, although it was technically illegal, could serve as comfortable places to live as well. And the buildings were relatively cheap. A hot artist who managed to sell out a show or two could buy a whole building, as Donald Judd did in 1968. Alternatively, 3 or 4 artists or artist couples could pool resources to share a building, each with their own floor. The studios and residences led to artist-run exhibition spaces like 112 Green Street, founded in 1970, and to commercial galleries, starting with Paula Cooper in 1968, and followed shortly thereafter by O.K. Harris in the person of Ivan Karp, Leo Castelli, Ileana Sonnabend, Andre Emmerich, and others. At first, there was only one watering hole, Finelli's, on Prince Street, and no restaurants to speak of, only storefront comidas Corollas with takeout food consisting mostly of chicken, rice, and beans. The lack of inspired dining led to the creation of Food, a community gathering place founded by artists, with eclectic menus that sometimes surpass the conventional notion of what real food might be. Gordon Matta Clark, one of food's artist founders, along with Carol Gooden and Tina Giroux, famously produced a bones menu that featured bones as a key ingredient of every dish. Paradoxically, this burst of energy in Soho was taking place at one of the worst of times for New York City. The city was not in good shape, to put it mildly, either physically or financially. The streets were grimy and potholed. The benches on Upper Broadway were filled with bundled up homeless folk, their pilfered Gristedes shopping carts filled with their possessions, and trash blew into pedestrians' eyes whenever the wind came barreling across the Hudson from New Jersey. Still, I was fortunate to arrive just as Soho was taking shape, in large part because during my periods of unemployment, I could get work as a day laborer helping to demolish the old interiors of prospective loft spaces. What kinds of artists could afford to pay for such renovations, I couldn't imagine. I only knew that at the end of the day, somebody would hand me a $20 bill, almost a tenth of the monthly rent for my one-bedroom apartment uptown. But I also benefited by being in on the ground floor as the market center of contemporary art shifted from 57th Street on either side of Fifth Avenue to West Broadway between Spring and Prince. And I go on.
Wonderful. Boy. Andy, you know, that makes me think of just how jealous I am of you. I mean, it's as though you had been in Florence, or Rome, I should say, in 1510, or Paris in 1910. It just seems like the perfect moment to have arrived in New York to witness the blooming of one of the great watersheds, I think, in the history of Western art. I don't know if that's really appreciated quite as that because we take it for granted, because it simply led to where the art world is now. It seemed natural and normal for us to look at that moment.
One of the reasons I wanted to write this book was I felt through my teaching that students were getting further and further away from the experience of this incredibly important revolutionary time, and as you said, just assuming that this is the normal state of affairs, the way things have always been. So I wanted to really put it down on paper that this was an historical event that really changed things the way they were, and the way things are today can't be understood unless you look back at this period to find the roots of them in the 70s and the 80s.
It is interesting, isn't it, that it hasn't really been completely historicized or mythologized the way, 1910 in Paris got mythologized pretty quickly as an amazing moment, but I'm not sure, funnily enough, that 1970 in New York quite has, maybe because the continuity is too great. Maybe because we still, in a sense, are in 1970 in New York and haven't quite graduated out of it, and we can't quite look back on it. Does that make sense to you? It does seem to me. My favorite work is still all lens-based, and some of it could have frankly been made in 1975, even though I love the work that was made in 2020.
Yeah.
Does that sound? Do you feel that way?
I think so. If you look at the fields of, say, pop music or dance, I've been seeing all sorts of recapitulations and reconstitutions of the 70s in those fields on PBS or in books. There's lots of writing that's been done about that, and yet I think the art world seems to have just moved on. Of course, it's been busy, but I think hopefully this will prompt a more thorough consideration of that time.
Or maybe it's that it hasn't really moved on, for want of a better word, aesthetically all that much. So there's not, in music, people look back nostalgically at music that's that old and use it as a source to riff on. It kind of can be turned in, you can have a neo folk rock moment, but it seems to me that in art, maybe we're still to a certain extent there. Those photo-based practices that you talk about in the book are still completely present in today's practice, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, it's possible there's a kind of embarrassment about the word postmodernism, and people aren't quite sure whether we've moved on from that or we've rejected it, or whether it just continues on being a postmodern period forever. And I think that's that would be another book, but it's certainly an issue that I hope this book makes people think about.
Andy, can I pull you back even further? Because what I'd like to hear about, at least briefly, is how you first recognized photography as being of interest and photographic art being of interest. I mean, I remember going to an Ansel Adams show when I was, I think, 12 years old. And that's what really blew me away and kind of started my career in commercial photography and really eventually as an art critic. When did you first look at photography as something you didn't just take for granted, but really wanted to chew on?
Well, I could blame it all on my father, except that my father was an amateur snap shooter that made us look at slideshows whenever he went on vacation. But that should have made me hate photography. I don't know why it didn't. But then one year he lent me his camera, and it was really doing photography myself that got me hooked into it. Of course, someone then gave me the obligatory gift at that time, which was the catalog to the Family of Man exhibition that Edward Steichen had done in the mid-50s, which was sort of a feel-good compendium of human nature from birth to death. But I think also I got more and more interested in it as I encountered resistance to it. So when I was in college, I thought, well, I'm interested in taking pictures. I should take a course. So I went to the art department and said, what courses do you have in photography? And they said, no, we don't teach photography. That's not an art form. Forget about it. And so I couldn't study there then. Now, of course, they have an MFA program in photography, so things have changed. But at that point, photography was sort of off the menu of art departments. And even in art history, I relate in the book that I studied art history with Jansen's survey of the history of art, which everybody did. And photography was not mentioned once in the entire book. It wasn't until, way later, 25 years later, after I studied art, that Jansen's son put a chapter about photography into the history of art.
Do you remember the first time that you looked at photography as art? The first photography show you saw? You had the Family of Man, but did you think of that as art even, or did you think of it as photography, which was a separate thing?
I think I just thought about photography as photography until I got a magazine called Camera, which was published in Switzerland, and it had a portfolio of pictures that seemed totally strange to me, but somehow intellectually complicated and curious. And they were by a photographer I'd never heard of named Lee Friedlander. And they had things like his shadow in the middle of the picture and people seeming to bump into things in the landscape. And I just thought, or reflections in side view mirrors, I thought, these are really the weirdest pictures I've ever seen. And I think at that point, I started really seeking out reading and critical literature about photography, of which there wasn't that much at the time. But I got into reading Aperture magazine. I read Newhall's History of Photography. And of course, I read John Tchaikovsky's books, looking at photographs. And when it came out, The Photographer's Eye. So that sort of got me interested in finding out about photography more than just being a practitioner.
Yeah, it's funny. Friedlander's actually what made me quit photography, because when I discovered Friedlander, I thought I could never do anything a tenth as good as this. This is so much more complex than anything I've ever done or ever could do. I actually quit photography, and in those days, you're right. I had to quit university track in order to go to photography school, because it was the only place you could study photography. And then when I quit photography, I could go to university. Yeah. This was the 70s. They were completely separate activities. at that
I
point?
mean, one of there are several narratives going on at once in the book, and one of them is this sense of photography in itself finally coming into its own and finding acceptance in the art world as photography and out of the photography tradition. So there's a boom of growth in photography programs in colleges and universities. They're in museums. They start adding photography curators. They start adding photography departments, collections, photography magazines, and then photography galleries. So when I got to New York in '71, there was Whitkin Gallery and then Light Gallery opened when I got there. And those were really, there had been galleries before in the 50s and 60s that were sort of non-commercial things, but Whitkin and Light were really the first commercial galleries that became a model for 10 years later. There were dozens of these galleries that were specific to photography, many of which are still around.
It does strike me, though, I come across often, I think in the latest Avedon biography, this is said as well, that photography had such a hard time being accepted as an art form, well into the 60s, et cetera. But that's always seems to me to need complicating, because of course MoMA had a photography department from 1940, and I was looking at, well, in fact, Andy Warhol's textbook from 1940 when he was in college, and it talks plenty about photography. The Bauhaus, Moholy-Nagy talks about photography. It seems to me the market is implicated in that. It wasn't so much that no one talked about it as art or as an art form, but that the market really neglected it. Does that feel right to you, that was the central issue?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it was a strain of contemporary art that was probably is appreciated more now than it was at the time. But that whole Bauhaus tradition, many of the expatriates from the Bauhaus came over and taught in the United States and really changed the way we thought about photography. Moholy-Nagy in Chicago being the most important figure, who became associated. He started something called the New Bauhaus, which then became the Institute of Design in Chicago. And that became a real hotbed of photography and thinking about photography in the context of art as a whole. So one of the students there who later became a teacher, Nathan Lerner, I always loved because he was also a designer, and he designed the honey container that the honey bear that your honey comes in. That was designed by Nathan Lerner, who's also a photographer. So there was a sense that it's connected to other things. And it's important to know that the other Bauhaus outpost was Black Mountain College, where Rauschenberg went. And Rauschenberg started doing photographs while he was at Black Mountain, took lots of pictures, and in fact, even toyed with the idea for a while of making photography his main thing. Thank goodness he didn't. But
I didn't know that, actually. I've read so much about him, but I didn't realize that was an option for him at one point. Yeah. So you become a photography critic in New York, a really noted photography critic in New York. Is there a moment when you realized, I'm not a photography critic, I've just become an art critic? That is, I'm now doing the same thing, talking about the same works as other people who used to just call themselves art critics. Is there a moment where you realized that those borders were blurring?
Well, I think the first thing to think of is the realization that I realized there were those borders, because as I mentioned in the part that I read, I was going down to Soho right from the get-go when I got to New York. And part of that was because my ambition then was not to be a critic, it was to be a poet. So I was hanging out with poets, and poets were hanging out with artists. And so there were all my connections to Soho, the Holly Solomon's 98 Green Street loft, a lot of other places was based on me being a poet who was there looking at artists. And I quickly realized that one of the functions that poets had in the art world was to write criticism about art. So meanwhile, in my other life, I was going to places like Whitkin Gallery and Light Gallery and going to the shows at the Museum of Modern Art. And thinking about photography as this separate thing. And I thought, well, I know all about photography more than I know about every other kind of art. So my service as a poet who becomes a critic could be to photography. And there were a few years when I was thinking that I was a poet slash photographer slash critic. And eventually, I think I realized that the thing I could do best was to be the critic who wrote about photography.
Did you write about art first? That is, are there some art reviews that predate your photography reviews? What would they have been of?
No, I really started out writing straight photography reviews. My first piece was about a Edward Weston retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art for Art in America. And so I was really seen as the guy who could deliver about photography. But I did at the Times, I did a profile on Frank Stella. I did a piece for the magazine about Rauschenberg. So I kind of crossed over into contemporary art later, and I crossed over to contemporary art at the same time that the use of photography was crossing over into contemporary art, in the sense of the whole picture generation. And I feel like I was, at the time, I felt slightly older than the pictures generation, but then I came to realize later that I actually am in the pictures generation, since I can remember when the first TV arrived in my house. That's my defining element of the pictures generation, is you grew up with television.
But there was, I think, I'm just old enough to remember when it was pretty clear that there were photography critics and art critics. And it sounds like you were wearing two hats. You were doing photography criticism, and then you were writing about Frank Stella. When did those two things, I guess I would say that now, as a critic working now, I wouldn't distinguish those two practices. When I write about photography, I'm the same person who writes about, I never write about painting, but let's say video or performance or whatever. When did those two things seem to collapse for you? Is there a moment where you suddenly realized, oh, when I write about photography, I'm just writing about contemporary art?
I think when I started to write more and more about photography in the context of galleries and museums that weren't about photography, that right. Photography was appearing in places that had no allegiance or relationship to any kind of photography tradition or John Tchaikovsky's idea of what photography was. And I was more interested in that, actually, than, since I'd grown up with thinking about photography the way John Tchaikovsky did. I really wanted to open up the discourse, if you will, to have a broader conversation about photography, not so much as a medium, which is, I think what photography got stuck on was its existence as a medium, and talk more about the way photography manifested itself functionally in the culture as an instrument of representation, as something that had a purpose. And luckily, at the same time, we were starting to see photography shows and books that had to do with, like Avedon, had to do with fashion, had to do with photojournalism, had to do with commercial photography, that the idea of what photography could be as an art got to be broader and broader, especially in the 80s.
Well, you've opened up a bunch of cans of worms that I wanted to stir up, so I'm not sure where to begin. I guess, it's interesting that it's sort of sociological, institutional, the change, as much as it is, for want of a better word, artistic. That is, things start being shown in different places by different people. It's interesting that there's a kind of social history that needs to be written at the same time as there needs to be a kind of straight art history written right. about these things. Do you think there's a loss at all in the loss of photography as a discipline? I remember the pleasure I took in the zone system, in getting a Max Black in my prints. In a way, I don't miss that at all, but I do feel as though there's some kind of a loss in the loss of interest in the craft of photography. That was a major cultural phenomenon, if you like. The craft of photography meant something. Do you feel any nostalgia for that? Any loss involved in photography just becoming another art form?
Actually, I don't. But I don't think there's been this absolute loss. I think that there still exists a sense of photography as something that is incredibly interesting technologically in terms of craft. And I think, if you look at an artist like Hiroshi Sugimoto, he knows the zone system 3 times better than you and I combined. And all his work, especially the more recent work that has to do with colors, he's totally into like what light does and how it works. And I think that's true of a number of other artists as well. So I don't think there's an absolute abandonment of the idea that photography is interesting in part because of the kind of pictures that it can make. I think there are still artists that are working with that, and I think they're important in some sense. But I think the idea of photography as a form of art is just spread out into so many different territories. It's almost, I mean, if you miss anything, it's the fact that you can identify something immediately as photography and say, oh, I'm going to go see photography, because it's so diffused throughout contemporary art. This is why I think students today don't recognize how signally important it is that photography is in the art world, because it just seems to be suffused throughout everything they experience.
Although, do you think that's completely true? It does still feel as though there's a distinction, weirdly, after what are we now, 50 years, between photo-based art and photography. I mean, if I remember going to see your students' work at the Corcoran, it did feel as though there were people who were still photographers more than anything. They loved the equipment. Even if they didn't love the equipment, they were taking photographs, often street photographs in the kind of grand tradition. And then there seemed to be students who often bridged your department and the fine art, the studio art department, who seemed to be doing something else. It feels as though that distinction hasn't totally died. Do you agree with me?
I do agree with you. It's a kind of source of, I hope, creative tension in the world, and that there's still a segment of the marketplace that's specifically devoted to photography as photography, and I think that's not to be dismissed. I think that's an important aspect. This the same way there are people that are so devoted to painters. While the 70s and 80s were happening, I had to keep listening to painter friends of mine bemoan the fact that, oh, painting's so out of fashion. What can we do? What can we do? What they proved what they could do, which is make new kinds of painting. But in the same sense that people are still attached to painting as a specific medium, and I don't think being attached to photography as a medium is any different than that.
Or for that matter, I mean, I think almost a better comparison is ceramics, only because ceramics have now been introduced in the last, 10 years or so as something very interesting for contemporary art, but there still is a separate, quite different practice in ceramics, and the people doing it in contemporary art often are actually kind of ignorant of what it means to make a good pot, or in the history of all of that. There do still seem to be quite two separate areas that are intersecting. Have you seen any contemporary photo-based artists who are now going back to an interest in the craft of photography, the way that contemporary artists are interested in the craft of ceramics? Has it been thematized, for want of a better word, now in contemporary art, this interest in old-fashioned craft and photography? Have you noticed that at all? Is photography now an old-fashioned craft that can be grabbed by contemporary artists?
I'm not sure this is strictly in terms of craft, so it might not answer that question, but there certainly is a movement that's been going on since the 90s, and I mentioned this in the very end of the book. A group of artists who are interested in making pictures that bring back the very beginnings, the origins of photography, a kind of first principles of photography. So there are photographers and artists who just make photograms. They make pinhole photographs, give a shout out to Barbara S., who recently passed away, but she was like a pinhole photographer artist. That the idea of abstraction, of just dealing with light as a subject, you see in everyone from, Ellen Carey, the Starnes in a way.
Tillmans has been working on that.
Tillmans. I mean, so there is a sense of, I don't know whether, I think it's less nostalgic than just a kind of intense curiosity about what are the first principles of this medium? How does it work at all? The sort of analog to that in the 60s and early 70s was that conceptual artists got totally fascinated with Muybridge's photography. And some of that was in the context of cinema. They were interested in sort of structuralist film, but another part of it was just the idea of this serial repetition of a picture fit into the ideas of seriality and organization that conceptual artists then were interested in. So, Saul LeWitt's fascination with Muybridge led him away from painting to make sculptures with cubes, but also led him to make photo books, artist books that were like every object in his loft that appeared that he could photograph is one of his books. I mean, it's a kind of cataloging process that is another sort of, it's not inherent in the medium, but it's inherent in the way the medium's been used over the years.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of your book, was when you're talking about that moment where documentation, it sounds so strange, isn't it? That suddenly people realize, oh, photographs can take pictures of things. Photographs can actually, I like the word ostend. They can point at stuff in the world. And it was this huge discovery that photography could just capture things in the world. And you do a wonderful analysis of that.
I mean, it was the age of immateriality, as Lucy Lepard said, the dematerialization of art. And yet they wanted to show people whatever was dematerialized, something they did out in the desert or a performance that they put on that lasted for 5 seconds. They needed to have something that showed that. And in a way, the photograph becomes the material object of the dematerialized art. But it's also curious because it's something that shows what it is and that they could exhibit, but it wasn't valued as something that, like, oh, you would want to buy that. So I mean, I remember going into Sonnabend or Castelli, and they would have these shows of conceptual artists that the show consisted of photographs, Douglas Hubler, for example, and yet you weren't buying photographs. Nobody bought photographs. So you were materializing the art, but you weren't really making anything of value to make a collector happy anyway.
But do you think, I mean, one of the things that seems have been present for at least the last 20 years is something that strikes me clearly, I think it strikes everyone, as an aesthetic of the documentary. That is a deliberately flat-footed aesthetic, an aesthetic, and it's there in Friedlander already, an aesthetic of the 4-square pose, just point the damn camera and shoot. Do you think it was there all along? That is, do you think a Conchi or Hans Hake really did appreciate that aesthetic, even as they were pretending they were just making documents? Or do you think the aesthetic came afterwards? So once you had pure documentation, people realized, oh, there's a look to this as well, and we can use the look. It eventually ended up in fashion photography with Wolfgang Tillmans, or with lots of people. What do you think? Which came first, the aesthetic or the document?
I think the practice came first. So I think that Akanchi, for example, started making pieces that used photographs without any sense of, oh, these are in a documentary tradition. But I think that, like all artists, he was learning as he went along. He was discovering what he was doing. And I think he was finding out more about photography, mostly by doing it, but conceivably also by reading about it. And Art Forum, the Journal of Contemporary Art at the time, started having articles about photography, even in the late 60s, that shows that people were thinking about, well, what exactly does this photograph do? What style is it in? And there was a big, not a controversy, but a back and forth about when Byrne and Hillebecker had a show at Sonnabend, and they're sort of the classic flat, point the camera into the landscape and not have the sun shining people. There was a thing, well, it's contemporary art, right? And that somebody else said, well, they're photographs that rise to the level of art. And then somebody else wrote a letter to art form and said, no, they're not art. What they're doing is art. You know, it was a beautiful sort of example of raising that question. And Anna Mendieta, who I write about in the book, her work has the same problem, which is she would go into the landscape and perform with her using her own body and photograph the trace of her body or sometimes herself. And the question that's always plagued people is like, well, is the photograph her work of art, or is her going into the landscape and having somebody have a camera there the work of art? So I think the answer is yes and yes. I mean, I don't think you can ever pull that apart. It's that clearly she had the intention of doing something that was going to be photographed.
It is hard to imagine the Beckers not being aesthetic now. I mean, it just seems so intensely, there seems to be such an intense look to what they were doing. And you can imagine it parodied very easily. I mean, when I was a teenager yet, I think I bought one of their first books, the Blast Furnace book, and cut it up and framed the pages and put them on my wall in a big grid. It just seems so aesthetic now, and it's hard to recapture. I mean, it's one of the important things about your book, is recapturing that all these things we take for granted now as art, in fact, as artful, as artistic, as artsy even, started out as something that was on the cusp, that was difficult, you know?
I mean, I hope I get that across in the book, that my experience of going into a show in Soho and you know, having Gilbert and George standing on a pedestal singing, or I didn't see it, but Joseph Beuys being in a gallery with a coyote. I mean, you didn't know what you were going to run into at any moment. And that made it both exciting, but also more complicated and more something that you had to think about all the time in the way you look at art. I was glad to see you wrote today about looking at paintings by yourself and how that changed the encounter, because that's so important to think about then versus now, is that you could walk into a gallery and there would be nobody there, and you would be just staring at this art that made no immediate sense to you at all. And it was a process of standing there until you figured it out.
Of course, that's what I think a lot of us miss right now, is it seems so vanishingly rare that we see something that we can't pigeonhole, that we can't put into a category. And that sense of just saying, what the F is this, as was obviously the case with the Beckers when they were first exhibited. That's what we're all, in a sense, looking for. And we're all jealous of you for having had it with so many great artists. You know, we mentioned the market for photography and that it seemed to have an important role in the world of fine art photography when that still existed or when that was ruling. Did the market have an important role in photo-based art? I mean, it did provide a new bodies of work for dealers to sell or to open galleries around even. You know, I'm thinking of Metro Pictures and Cindy Sherman. Did it seem as though the market was also involved in that dynamic, or did the market come to it much later after the artist came to it?
I think the market came after the artist came, but I have to give credit to Metro Pictures, because I think that was really the watershed when it opened at the beginning of the 80s, that it changed the way in which people understood the market for photographs. And it's like, Cindy Sherman, bless her heart, is making photographs. That's all she's ever done. And yet they could command tens of thousands of dollars, whereas a photographer, Lee Friedlander, for example, would be like hard to get into the even five figures. So there was this huge disparity, and it exists today still. I mean, if you look at somebody like Jeff Wall or Andreas Gursky, the prices that their work commands, because they're seen in a different marketplace. So, I mean, when you're a critic, when you're looking at art, you're always influenced and aware of the marketplace as being some part of what it is that's making the world go round. But as much as possible, I try to not have that marketplace be a narrative that's the main story that's creating art. I really don't believe that art proceeds by marketplace. Otherwise, you would have had 50 million Andy Warhols by now.
Well, we have NFTs. Now we have NFTs, but let's not go there, please.
We may be
NFT
more
talk.
Warhols soon, but you know, I think that artists are working in ways that kind of comes in and out of cultural fashion, and the lucky ones really strike a chord. And I think that's why Cindy Sherman became so important, because she was the right person with the right work at the right time.
You mentioned Gursky and Jeff Wall, and I think we only have a few more minutes before we take questions, but it's a perfect opportunity to bring up the question of scale and size, because that does seem to have been important in this. Not at the very beginning. I mean, Cindy Sherman's untitled film stills were small, and the Beschers are making small works. When did scale seem to become important to you? Did you write about it at the time? Talk about a little bit about when photographs got huge.
Sure, I do write about in the second half of the 80s, larger pictures started to appear. I think Sandy Skogland's Revenge of the Goldfish is the one that I always remember. It was like 4 by 5 feet. Or there was a show called Big Pictures at the Museum of Modern Art, and there was a Tina Barney picture of reading the New York Times that was 4 by 5 feet, and that just seemed like so big. It was like, and people knew that photography was wanting to compete with painting, and that one of the ways you could compete with painting would be hold the wall the same way that painting holds the wall. But then there was the Big Picture show at MoMA, and then Marvin Heiferman a couple of years later did a show called The Real Big Picture at the Queens Museum, which is really much more about artists' use of photography in large scale. And then technologically, I think there was just a breakthrough in the scale in which people could make prints, and especially, I mean, this is by this time color. The other thing we could talk about is the entrance of color at the same time. Painting has colors, photography was black and white. So if you want to compete with painting, color would be better. So photographers were shifting to color photography, and labs were able to make bigger and bigger prints. So at first it was 4 by 5 feet, but then when you get later, there was a European lab that could make larger prints, so that the students of the Beckers, Thomas Roof, Gursky, Thomas Struth, they could make really big pictures, until today, where since they're manufactured digitally, they can, by inkjet, they can be practically any size you want them to be.
Did you have any resistance to it? Did there feel like there was some hypertrophy going on? Did it feel to you as though scale was there just for its own sake, because among other things it was more valuable, but it makes a splash? Did you ever think, no, when things were small, that Cindy's untitled film stills had plenty of power without being big?
Well, I think if she would have made the untitled film stills big, I would have hated them, because they're supposed to be film stills.
Right.
Right? I mean, they were totally appropriate for the conceptual frame that they had. So of course they had to be 8 by 10.
Though she has gone on to enlarge them, which
so hers have gotten bigger, but they've gotten bigger sort of in relation to the paintings that they make reference to, or the walls that they're hanging on. I think there were occasions when I thought that some less important artists were just trying to catch the wave of getting things big. But I mean, I think it's really interesting when you look at a Gursky photograph and it's like bigger than you are, and that's something you're used to if you're looking at a Anselm Kiefer painting full of straw and paint and facticity, but in a giant photograph, it's just as interesting, I think.
And of course, Jeff Wall made that absolutely explicit. I mean, the relationship between his paintings and big old master paintings was, he made it explicit in his writings, but it's also right there in the photographs themselves. They need to be exactly that size.
And what's interesting is that the switch over to larger scale actually brought people's attention that hadn't been paying attention before. And I like to think of Michael Fried, who made it a point to ignore photography for 50 years of his career. Suddenly, when photographs got big and colorful and in your face, he became really interested in teasing out what it was about these photographs that made them interesting, or in his frame of things, anti-theatrical.
I guess we probably have virtually no minutes left, but I'll ask the question every moderator is supposed to ask of the person they're talking to. Do you see any hints of future in photography that's different from what you lived? Do you ever see things that you think shouldn't be made? Do you get up in arms and say, no, that's not what it's supposed to be? Have you noticed anything that has struck you as interesting in the last 5-10 years? Do your students bring things to you that you can't place?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have students anymore, but the work I've seen, I'm interested in people like Trevor Peglin, who's actually addressing the new uses of photography since it's become digital. I'm interested in work that addresses surveillance, like Jill Magid or Sophie Cal, the idea of photography as being this instrumental presence in our lives that's watching us or targeting us. It's been weaponized. All that stuff I think is really interesting fodder for today's artists. And there are a number of artists I'm interested in that are thinking about the way in which photography, you can say it's digital, but it's also just kind of the profusion of cameras has changed the way we experience the world.
Yeah, it's kind of like, the documentary turn in photography suddenly realized that photographs could represent, and it feels as though these artists that you mentioned are interested in kind of a meta level of what it is for a photograph suddenly to represent us. It's one thing to say, isn't it cool that photographs can point at the world? And then all of a sudden you realize, no, they're pointing at us. This is a problem. This isn't just a fascinating fact. It's not just a documentary turn. It's a surveillance turn.
Yeah. They recognize us. Do we want them to recognize us? I don't know.
That's right. Do you take photographs anymore?
I've been taking snapshots for years and years, but my rusty trusty 8x10 camera, which I got in the wake of the new topographic show because it suddenly seemed important to take large format photographs. I haven't really cranked the bellows on that camera, or haven't gotten under the hood lately. So, but I would like to get back to that.
Wow, I think you should start putting 8x10 images onto Instagram. It would be a whole sort of wormhole through time from the past to the present. I thought we were. Oh, here's a question. Someone called Henry asks. This is a question for you, obviously. Okay. Which writers influenced you as you began art writing? And did you have any models as you wrote this particular book?
Ah, that's an interesting question. Thanks for that. So the writers that I was first interested in were poets who were reviewing art. And I sort of was interested in how this sideline worked out. So the probably best known example of that would be Peter Schjeldahl, who's turned out to be a pretty good critic after all. But I actually studied his poetry when I was in poetry school because I thought he was like tremendously funny as a poet and used language so well. And I think his criticism is maybe less funny than his poetry is, but his use of language is just so unmistakable and so beautiful. So I'm still a fan of Peter's work, but there were poets everywhere who were writing. Carter Radcliffe was a poet. John Yao was a poet. I'm leaving somebody out, I'm sure. Bill Berkson used to write criticism. So sort of that era of critics. I mean, I read Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg just to feel like I was up on the world, but I didn't actually think that I took anything particularly from them. And in terms
of a little less fun, maybe.
In terms of this book, I was when I was in New York, I got acquainted with Irving Sandler, who was for years working on this book about art in the postmodern era, which finally came out. And I thought that was such a great idea to cover the art of his time. The only thing that I thought was that, well, he was running around to all these galleries and seeing all this work, which he shapes into a beautiful narrative, but he's nowhere in the story. So it's like his experience masquerading as some sort of authoritative narrative of everything that's happening in the art world. And that's one thing I want to stress about this book, is that it's not everything that was happening in the art world. It's just, I was lucky enough that New York was the center of contemporary art. New York was the center of a whole movement to have photography galleries and make a marketplace for it. And that's where I was. So I can claim to represent that, but I didn't go to Beijing in the 70s to see what they were doing in photography there then. So I can't claim to have covered all the waterfront.
There's another question, a natural follow-up from Catherine. And she asks, what books or authors would you recommend, besides your own, to those trying to start writing about photography?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'd still start with John Tchaikovsky's Looking at Photographs, because he sort of gives you a variety of ways to approach a photograph, not comprehensive because they're largely formal ways, but I think it's still beautiful writing, and it's got many different avenues that you can follow or not. And then I would think I would want to read, Rosalind Krauss or Doug Crimp are one of my favorite October magazine authors. I think Doug Crimp has some really important articles that are explanatory, even if they're argumentative, about where contemporary art was with photography in the 80s. So you could read his essay for the Picture Show. You could read his the library's old, the museum, the library's old, the museum's new subject, and a lot of other essays like that.
It was an exciting moment for art history too. We've left that out, of course, but there was a real cross-fertilization between the ideas in postmodern art history and the ideas in lens-based art. I mean, Jeff Wall being the perfect sort of intersection of the two. And I think they were being cross-fertilized in really important, interesting ways at that moment.
One of the themes of the book is that photography went from being a sort of useful tool for artists to being the subject of art. In the postmodern era of the 80s, art was really, even if you were a painter, you were talking about photography in one way or another, because the way in which you could talk about representation and culture, the way in which cultural messages were sent to you was through the medium of photography.
I think we have time for one last question. Justine asks, was there something you found in your research that surprised you? A work or a photographer you hadn't considered yet? So did you add anything to your personal experiences? Did you discover something new in the course of writing the book that you might not have put in if you hadn't written the book?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of examples, since it took me like 4 years to write it, that I had lots of aha moments. And all the research wasn't just in books or reading old criticism. I was still going to see shows, and one of the shows I saw was the Carolee Schneemann show that was at PS1. And I kind of knew that she'd done these photographs and sort of hadn't really thought about how central they were to the kind of feminist art that came later. But I realized when I saw the show, holy smokes, she's like really important. So now she has a fairly substantial section of one chapter. And I think the same is true of Adrian Piper, who had a show at MoMA while I was working on the book. And I hadn't quite gotten how extensive her use of photography was throughout her career, which is largely conceptual and based issues of identity being her main subject. I mean, she used photography to work a lot of that out.
Yeah, as all those figures did, as you point out in the book.
Yeah.
You know, that photography is the way you represent your ideas if you're not doing them in any other medium, you know. Yeah. I think we're just about out of time, I believe. We've reached 7 o'clock, and that's when we were supposed to end. So, Andy, I just want to tell you what a pleasure it was to read your book. I think it's really important. I mean, there's nothing that matters more to me, at least, than photo-based art. And I think even if people don't know it matters to them, it matters to them. That it does still feel like a really exciting part of contemporary art, which is kind of a miracle all these years later. And it's partly thanks to people like you writing about it.
That's very kind. And thank you very much for doing this and for saying that. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And thanks also to Anthony at the Paula Cooper Gallery and to Evan and Victoria at 192 Books for arranging this and getting Blake and I together.
I think Anthony's going to give us a final word, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Wonderful.
I'm trying to, oh, here I am. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. Andy, you mentioned in the book that the history of photography is in many ways recursive. And I thought that was a very interesting point, because thinking of today, when we seem to be in the new golden age of portraiture, with photographers like Deanna Lawson, where suddenly we return to a quote unquote traditional form formally of photography, but with a completely new approach and a new intent. So anyway, thank you so much for this. The book comes out next Tuesday, and please come visit us at 192 Books to get your copy. We're open every day, and we're on 10th Avenue. Between 21st and 22nd Street. You can also order it by phone or email or use our bookshop page. And we'll have a recording of this conversation on our gallery page as well. That's paulacoopergallery-studio.com. Our next event is on Tuesday, and it will be a discussion of the new Francis Bacon biography by Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan, in conversation with Michael Carey. So please tune in for that. And I also wanted to mention, we may have a very interesting follow-up to tonight's conversation. That will be a discussion of Jeff Dyer's new book, Seesaw, Looking at Photographs. And that's going to be on May 6th, and it will be a conversation between Dyer and Teju Cole. So mark your calendars, and we'll see you then. Thank you both.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bye-bye.